A recap of our top story now. The US government is stepping in to shore up confidence in the banking system following the sudden collapse of Silicon Valley Bank.
The fact that they went beyond the $250,000 statutory limit and say depositors are going to be kept whole is both a sign of how concerned they are that this could spread.
The Biden administration has announced it will extend a federal backstop to all of the failed banks' deposits.
And money came gushing in during the COVID crisis. Silicon Valley Bank put a lot of that to work in high-yielding assets. Today, in order to attract and maintain deposits, you have to pay up.
What happened with SVB?
Very simple. This is a combination, a powerful one, of idiot management with a board above them that was incompetent. To make the bets they made means they know nothing about banking. I hate to be so blunt, but that's a horrible combination. They blew themselves up the old-fashioned way. Idiots.
Welcome back to Why Are We Like This, the only true crime podcast that treats Florida like the active crime scene it is. As always, I am joined by my co-host, Tomas Kennedy. Hello, Tomas.
Hey, coming at you all hot from Miami traffic. Let's go.
From live on I-95 or some thereabouts?
Yep.
And if Tomas is here or in his car en route somewhere, that can only mean that I'm also joined by my other co-host, Gerald Doherty. Jer, how goes it?
I'm doing all right. I'm at a Super 8 in Decatur, Georgia, just outside Atlanta. Hope I'll be back in New York by tomorrow.
That's what's up. So that was a really long haul that you pulled too. Good kudos on that one.
We started at 5 p.m. and we got here at 10 in the morning. Going
where many, pulling the drive that many, long haul cocaine dealers have done many times.
I'm in the information dealing business these days.
Fellas, I'm flush right now. I don't know about
dangerous drug, you know.
I don't know about you guys, but on Monday I hit up the old JP Morgan Chase branch. I did what every responsible consumer across the country should definitely be doing right now. I withdrew every dime to my name, went fully liquid. While all of you fools get stuck on the wrong side of an inevitable bank run, I am in the process of converting my life savings into the most stable and liquid investment there is, cryptocurrency. You might be wondering why someone like me would choose to do something that seems so stupid. And to that,
buy low and sell high.
Exactly. That's what they taught me in business school. To that, I would respond, you clearly are not following some of the same Silicon Valley luminaries and icons that I follow, who have assured me that because their bank seems to be falling apart, everything is probably pretty close to falling apart. Today's guest is Doug Henwood, whose name you know from a career spent reporting and writing about economics and finance. He's also a contributor at The Nation, where he just today published A Death in the Valley, what the end of SVB reveals about VC class solidarity. He is also the host of Behind the News podcast and radio show, so check that out as well. Doug, welcome to Why Are We Like This?
Oh, thanks for having me. I feel like I live in a very different world than you Florida folks in cars and things. I'm here in my Brooklyn bedroom.
That's a really good point. I want to level sit here a little bit because this is a Florida podcast and people are probably wondering, hey, Silicon Valley, 3,500 miles away from us. Why does this story matter? And we're going to get to that. But
you're getting a lot of refugees from Silicon Valley taxation. And
that's
costs,
exactly
right?
Yes. At least part of them are the reason that Tomas is stuck in traffic right now.
Yes.
Dipshit mayor.
And our dipshit mayor. For our listeners, Doug, who maybe don't have the same familiarity with this situation, can we start with a quick recap? What is, or was, I guess, Silicon Valley Bank, and why have we all had to learn about it over the course of the last 10 days?
Well, like 10 years ago, it was a small regional bank that serviced tech businesses in the Silicon Valley. Starting around 2018, when the Trump administration, with the help of Barney Frank, bank lobbyist, former senator, former House member, and the one of the names on the Dodd-Frank bill, they decided they were going to ease regulations on like mid-sized banks. And so that meant there wouldn't be any kind of scrutiny, no stress tests that the Federal Reserve and the other regulators apply to the big banks to see how they could handle various financial difficulties. So Silicon Valley Bank grew like crazy. And at the same time, the whole venture capital industry, the whole tech industry was just rolling in cash because the Federal Reserve was pumping money into the system to initially get out of the Great Recession, and then they were pumping more cash. When COVID hit, they kept interest rates close to zero for a decade, which is just manna for speculation. They love low interest rates. They borrow, and also then if there's no easy way to earn a few points of interest. If then you just go for more and more aggressive investments. The tech industry and the venture capitalists were just rolling in cash, and they're putting a lot of it in Silicon Valley Bank. Silicon Valley Bank then discovered that it really didn't know what to do with all that money. It's tech customers, it's VC customers just rolling in cash. They didn't need to borrow any money. Now, the normal thing a bank does is takes deposits. It's oversimplifying, but not dangerously. They take deposits and with that make loans. And then with the money they can't lend out, they buy securities, usually things like treasury bonds, safe stuff. And so the normal bank has between 60 and 80% of its money in loans and the balance in securities. Silicon Valley Bank kind of turned that on its head. They just didn't have that much in the way of loans and a whole lot of securities. And they bought a lot of bonds at a very low, when interest rates were close to zero. As interest rates rose over the last year, the bonds fell in value, which is what older bonds do when interest rates rise. And they found themselves with very large paper losses. And the regulators should have noticed this. They should have told them not to do it. The management should have been on top of this. They didn't have a risk officer for all of last year. Or most of last year. So it just, at least on paper, was falling into the red. Its savvy venture capital customers and tech customers found out and immediately launched a run in the bank. And within a matter of hours, really, it was pretty much dead.
You called this maybe the first ever social media, and I'm paraphrasing from your article, the social media enabled bank run. Like, we have not seen something like this.
Yeah, that's what it just sped it up so quickly. The tech guys, the VCs, were on their Slack channels and on their WhatsApp channels. Then there are people on Twitter who were saying this thing is doomed. Get all your money out, and it just happened so quickly. We've had many bank failures in U.S. history. We had like 5,000 in the early 1930s. We had about 2,000 in the 1980s and early 90s. So we've had bank failures and many bank failures in American history. But this one, just the time scale was so sped up because of instant communication. And it's just remarkable that these guys. Then what's in the headline is that they say and write all these sentimental things about what a wonderful place it was. There's a piece in the Financial Times by one of their VC customers that everybody knew your name. It's like a homey local market. And then when it hit a wall, as some VC said to the Financial Times, when you want to be the one who panics first. Right. You don't want the other guy to get the money there first. Now, part of the issue was that bank deposits are insured by the FDIC, but they cap them at $250,000. Something like 95% of their deposits were over that limit, and so everybody was scared they were not going to get insured.
Right. This was a cash-rich crowd, as you mentioned a moment ago. Like, these were people who were enjoying the benefits of mostly free money for a really long time.
Yeah, I mean, imagine having a problem like that, having so much money you don't know what to do with it. It's really
Isn't that a line in every recent Scorsese movie where the guy is a criminal?
Doug, so I don't mean to be crude, and maybe I'm being unsophisticated when I say this, but what you describe sounds a lot like a Ponzi scheme that was basically tolerated and allowed to operate. Is that an unfair assessment?
Well, there's an element of a Ponzi scheme about banking. Yeah. Banks generally, this is one of the major problems of finance over the centuries. Really, banks, as they say, borrow short and lend long. So if you put a deposit in a bank, you want to be able to get it tomorrow if you need it. But there aren't many loans that a bank can make that are like that. So they will lend people things for terms of years. So that's the problem, that you just have to have the faith that the bank is going to be there tomorrow and will be able to pay out. And the minute people doubt that and start withdrawing money, the bank is finished. They're just very vulnerable to these sorts of runs. And you can minimize the risks of that. The regulators are supposed to look over, their books and say, no, don't do that. They should have said, don't buy all these long-term bonds that expose you to very large losses, but they didn't. The Bloomberg reported earlier today that the San Francisco Fed, which is its local regulator, or one of its local regulators, had noticed that these were very risky things they were doing. And so they wrote all these anguished memos late last year, but management didn't do anything about it. And the senior management of the Federal Reserve didn't do anything about it. And so here we are with this enormous problem.
Tomas, this reminds me so much of it's analogous to the Democratic Party just setting up so many things during the course of the Obama era, where it's like, well, we're always just going to have a Democratic president forever, so we'll be okay. This is going to be fine if we set things up this way.
Well, they also thought, we're going to have interest rates of 0 or 1% forever.
Right, exactly. They thought that these conditions would stay, static forever, as if we don't average better than we do, Doug. What is it like on average? Every 8 years, this country has some sort of economic retraction or something.
Yeah, it used to be a lot quicker. The cycles used to be just 2 or 3 years, but we've gotten used to, since the 1980s, these long expansions. And in the early 90s, we had a mild recession after a long expansion in the 80s. In the early 2000s, we had the dot-com collapse, but even the real economy the recession wasn't that terrible. So we got used to these 8-year long expansions. And then we had another one that went from 2009, 2010. It took a long time to get out of that Great Recession, but we were out of it by 2010, more or less. And then we didn't really have a recession until COVID hit. So we went a decade with these really low interest rates and relatively placid circumstances. And it was not like people weren't. It wasn't a boom. People weren't really. The regular people were just not rolling in money, but it felt, reasonably comfortable as far as the standards of American capitalism go. And then suddenly the Federal Reserve, first we got hit by inflation, the Federal Reserve started raising interest rates, and then everything began to fall apart.
So Doug, we're talking about this risky behavior, right, that the bank was undertaking. And in your piece, you actually detail how SVB went without a chief risk officer for most of last year, but the responsibility wasn't one-sided in terms of just the bank, because you also detail that the FDIC, the feds, and the California banking authorities should have all intervened, and we've talked a little bit about that and caught this sort of risky behavior, but none of them did. So my question to you is, how is this possible? You know what I mean? How is a bank allowed to operate? 16th largest bank in America, I believe, without a chief risk officer for most of a year. Especially with the recession looming in the horizon, and then both state and federal financial regulators are just looking the other way and I don't know, eating shit.
Well, I think several things are going on. One is just, when things are going well, nobody wants to be the skunk at the picnic. There's that old joke, guy jumps out of a 40-floor building, and as he passes the 20th floor, somebody asks him how things are going, and he says, oh, pretty good so far. So that kind of consciousness always prevails. Alan Greenspan, during the housing boom in the early mid-2000s, used to say pretty much that, well, everything is okay so far, so we shouldn't get worried about inflated house prices and crazy mortgages and all those things that eventually cause so much trouble. So it's just that kind of, it's easy to get complacent, and it's easy to think that current conditions are going to last forever. I've read a lot of the Fed's, Federal Reserve's policy documents, and every quarter they do their projections for the next year or so. A couple of years, actually. And they're almost always just assuming that things are going to continue like they are. And I don't think there's anything sinister about this necessarily. It's just the way humans think. We always think whenever you do a prediction, they bunch of pollsters and such ask people what their expectations for future inflation and interest rates are, and they're almost always extrapolations of the present and recent past. That's just the way people look at the future. Also, we have what's called regulatory capture, that a lot of these agencies are just very much creatures of their own industry or staffed by people who would like to get jobs in that industry when they leave government service. Yeah. Now, the Fed, there are an awful lot of very smart and very competent people at the Fed, mostly the economists and people who do the analysis stuff. But the people who do the supervision generally come out of the industry or would like to get a job in the industry. If you're at a senior level of the Federal Reserve, you can get a very nice job in banking when you leave. And then there's that angle. And it's just also, I think, a lot of the bank examiners and such are civil servants who are paid on a government scale, who are probably in awe of the bankers that they're supposed to supervise. They think, oh, they're so rich, they must be smart. And they're intimidated by them. And it's easy to demystify what they're doing. So I think it's a combination of all those things, a bit of complacency, a bit of capture, and a bit of intimidation.
I was going to say, as you write in your piece, we're about to find out how many sectors of the economy are able to withstand historically normal interest rates rather than the low interest rate phenomena that we've had for the last decade and a half. In other words, how many sectors, how much of the economy can actually withstand, like we said, like a historically normal interest rate level.
Yeah, I mean, the average, just looking at historical averages, the so-called federal funds rate, which is the interest rate that the Federal Reserve most directly controls. It's the rate at which banks lend each other money overnight, and it's their basic policy rate. That's when they're setting a policy, they're targeting the federal funds rate. It's now about 4.5%, and to be normal, based on historical averages and inflation. Right now, it should be closer to 8%. So we still have, despite this pretty sharp tightening over the last year, we still have relatively low interest rates by historical standards. But it's clear that we have a financial system that has gotten so used to really low interest rates. And this is another angle, too. The Fed has been for the last few years, the Fed had pumped, the previous few years, the Fed had pumped about $5 trillion into the financial system. And it made sense coming out of the banking crisis of 2008 or the COVID crisis 2020, but, you can't do that forever. And they just kept doing that forever. They just kept expanding. And there was a period, I can't remember what year it was, maybe 2012, 13, when they started talking about how they were going to, as they say, taper this policy. And the markets freaked out. They threw what came to be known as the taper tantrum. And so the Fed said, oh, I guess we can't do that. So they went back to printing more money. So I think, you see these banks who've just loaded up on a lot of low interest rate bonds that are getting hit by higher rates. The FDIC says they have something like, I think, $640 billion in unrealized losses from this. As far as we know, it could be even worse. But then there's also the corporate sector. A whole lot of companies have been borrowing a lot of money at very low interest rates and not doing anything very noble with it. They're not investing in capital equipment or expanding or doing those things that businesses are supposed to do. They did a lot of it to buy back their own stock to boost its value. So it's a lot of companies now have a whole lot of debt on their balance sheets at low interest rates that won't be able to withstand a rise in interest rates. There's what has been dubbed zombie companies that are just kept alive by low interest rates that will die as interest rates rise. So we don't know what's going to happen. One of the things that happens as you get as a cycle matures, interest rates rise, financial conditions get tighter, and then the economy slows down. Something's going to blow up. And so Silicon Valley Bank was the first thing really that blew up, but it's probably not the last. There's probably just a whole lot of stuff we don't know about that's buried in the financial system or the corporate structure balance sheets and such that it could get ugly. We don't know. But it's not going to be pretty. And, so then the Fed is in this situation where, it's got 6% inflation. It's worried about that. I know a lot of people on the left don't really care about inflation, but I think it's hurt a lot of people. Yep. Every time I go to the grocery store, I'm just shocked how much everything costs. And that's a very serious problem. And the only tool they have to deal with that is raising interest rates, slowing down the economy. And but on the other hand, they are now seeing that the financial system has a whole lot of vulnerabilities in it, that higher rates will cause things to break. Throughout the last, for the first couple of years, first couple of decades after World War II, there were no real financial crises. We'd have little recessions, a little trouble here and there. The unemployment rate rise a bit, but starting in the early 70s, we started to see these crises. Penn Central in the early 1970s. Then at the end of the decade, when Volcker drove up rates to the teens, we had
SNL after that a few years later.
Just so many. We had the third world debt crisis. We had all these banking failures, the savings and loan crises. Early 90s, we had a whole bunch of additional bank failures. The dot-com bubble burst in the early 2000s. And then we had, of course, the granddaddy of them all, the financial crisis and deep recession of the mid 2000s, later on, 2008 to 2010. And we went, the COVID produced many strange phenomena. One of them being, just in a narrowly economic sense, was it looked like the economy was close to the verge of recession. In 2019. Interest rates were rising, the economy was slowing down, a whole lot of signs that things were getting mature. And then COVID hit, and then all these stimulus came in, big government spending programs, lower interest rates. So it was like that recession was averted and extended the expansion by another couple of years. And so as expansions get older, people do more and more reckless things, assuming that they're going to go on like that forever. And here we are. Finally, that COVID extension or post-COVID extension is coming due. And it seems like there could be lots of problems. There are a whole lot of other banks that also could follow Silicon Valley down the drain. First Republic, in many ways, a similar bank experiencing similar troubles. The big banks and the Federal Reserve and the Treasury are organizing attempts to keep it afloat, but they're really trying to. The fundamentals may be troublesome. They're just trying to preserve confidence, so people don't launch another bank run, because once a bank run starts, you got trouble.
So there's. To contain this, right? They said that they're not gonna. The Biden administration and the Feds are saying that this is not a bailout, right? They're not gonna bail out SVB. They're not gonna bail out investors. They're not gonna bail out the owners. They're only gonna basically make the depositors whole. But we know that depositors are insured up to $250,000, right? So they're basically stepping in and making sure that depositors that had more than $250,000 in this bank are made whole. But from what I've read, this is not your average bank with your average depositor. We're talking about companies that invested millions and millions and millions of dollars. I've heard, for example, that the company Roku, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think they had close to like $1 billion, deposited in this bank, which, how insane is that in terms of the CEO and the executives there to just put all their money into one bank? But I guess my question to you is, and in my opinion, I'll just be out front. I think it's wrong that we're making these depositors whole. You know what I mean? In capitalism, they took a risk on this bank, and that risk didn't pay off. But would you agree with that? And would you call this a bailout or not?
Well, let me make a couple of points here. First of all, the Roku thing, these companies, I saw this guy on Twitter who is a guy who made a lot of money as some kind of tech entrepreneur and now runs some nonprofits. And he had all his nonprofits money in this bank. And I said, have you ever heard of treasury bills? Why not? Why put all this money in a bank when you could do, treasury bills? They're not insured with bank insurance, but if the federal government can't pay its bills, we're really in trouble. Right. So I don't understand why people put so much money in this bank in the first place. It made no sense to me at all. But okay, they did it. I'm very sympathetic to your point of view that people need to take a hit. This is part of the problem with the kind of capitalism we run these days. All the risks are shifted to the non-rich. We have socialism for the rich. But the thing is, they've got us hostage. So if the people with deposits above 250 were not bailed out, there would have been runs in every other bank. And so the fear was that the whole system would come collapsing down if you had those sorts of runs. I guess they'd have to shut the banks like 1933 to prevent that kind of thing. So that's the risk, that if the panic spreads, and then you had people like Bill Ackman, the hedge fund dude, who just he makes his money by spreading fears about companies, and he shorts their stock, hoping it's going to decline, and then he talks a lot of shit about them. And then he was doing this with the banking system. So God knows what Bill Ackman's actual interest in all this is, but he's like, people follow him, people listen to him. He's a big hedge fund guy. He made billions of dollars, so he must know what he's talking about. So people like that are actually going to encourage panic instead of trying to calm it. So it's a bad situation. They've got us all hostage.
And I'm going to get a little populist here. You know what pisses me off, Doug? That when I have an overdraft fee on my credit card and I don't have a lot of money in my checkings account, and I have to call Bank of America, and stay there on the line for 2 hours to have some customer service representative, and it's not their fault, but you get on the phone with them, and you've spent hours waiting, and then they tell you basically like, there's nothing I can do for you, go fuck yourself. This is the bank policy. You know what I mean? That's the experience of the average American and the average person with the banking system. But then, the Silicon Valley Bank assholes fuck everything up. They fucked their bank up because they were irresponsible and they didn't make good financial decisions. And then you have people like Ro Khanna and Nancy Pelosi and other, elected officials from California who are close to the tech industry, basically making moves to bail these assholes out, right? And another thing that pisses me off is, we've had this policy of raising interest rates by the feds, you know what I mean? And basically trying to slam the brakes on the economy and cool down the economy, because of the inflation. And it's at the same time that I get why they're trying to do that, it's hurting your average worker, right? But now that it's hurt, you know what I mean? The depositors from SVB, oh my God, what's going to be the effect on Main Street? We can't allow this to happen. We have to intervene. So I just think that it's really hypocritical, and it really pisses me off. You know what I mean? The priorities.
I can't disagree with the word you said. I mean, but we have this weird model of capitalism now where the capitalist can never take a hit. The banking system is really weird. The banking system is essentially a public utility. Banks are very much at the center of the whole money system. They're inseparable from the money system. If the banking system goes, everything goes. I mean, and this is one of the reasons that crypto is so weird. Like, they have a hard time connecting with the real financial system. And so they live in their own universe, but you can't really do much with their coins. But, you're absolutely right that the tears being shed over the fact that these companies wouldn't be able to make payroll. I'm sure that was the first thing in their minds. They really cared about the workers. I mean, it's insulting. It's just, it's really insulting. And you just want to, as Mencken said, roll up your sleeve, hoist the black flags, and start slitting throats. I mean, it's just I can completely understand that populist impulse. But yes, we don't want to slit any throats. It's just a metaphor. H.L. Mencken was a colorful writer.
Yes.
It's maddening. And, I could also say that we've done all these bailouts now. We've had so many of them now. We're in like a fifth or sixth round of major bailouts since over the last, 40 some years. And nothing ever really changes. The proper approach would be, all right, we'll bail you out this time, but we're going to make sure you don't do it again. And Dodd-Frank, to some degree, was an attempt to make sure we didn't do it again. But then, as soon as Dodd-Frank passed and the crisis, the crisis felt like it was over, they started weakening it. So all the supervision was weakened.
Kicking the knees out of it.
And then, like Barney Frank himself, lobbies to weaken his own bill, and then gets a job on the board of Signature Bank, which is another one of these casualties of the last week. Less famous than Silicon Valley, but similar story. That was a lot of crypto stuff, but it was Barney Frank cashed in. He made like $2.5 million for essentially for as we don't want to say it's a reward. That would be
No.
jumping to conclusions and possibly involve litigation. But
We can't know his heart.
it looks kind of strange that he lobbied to soften the regulation and then ends up on the board of a bank that collapses because the regulations were softened.
Doug, can we talk about one of the central thesis in your article that we read prior to this episode, and that is the idea of sort of like class solidarity amongst all these ghouls that are trying to affect this outcome. And I'll be honest with you, I kind of at first disagreed. I read it your full article and ended up agreeing, but I did disagree in one way, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. There was at least, I wouldn't maybe call it solidarity, but there was absolutely some triangulation at the beginning of last weekend where anybody who's worked in communications could identify there was a concerted PR effort on social media to let people know from all of these high follow accounts and people who are very influential, letting us know this is all caps, the worst thing that is ever going to happen to anybody. Be afraid, be very afraid. So it did seem like they came together at least for that PR effort to affect an outcome of a bailout, which seems like they're probably going to end up getting. But you make some really good points about their inability to kind of coalesce. And I was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I was thinking, and I mentioned this in the piece, J.P. Morgan in the Panic of 1907 assembled all the major bankers in New York and locked them into his library until they came up with a bailout for this one particularly troubled brokerage firm, which was, if it had failed, it would have brought a whole bunch of stuff down. Yeah. And Morgan did it. He made money off this. He arranged the bailout so that one of his properties got treated very well. But on the other hand, he's like the brotherhood of the banking brotherhood had a leader, and the leader was able to force him to come to some kind of collective decision that actually saved their asses. Then the Panic of 1907 was serious enough, and that it's one of the reasons they created the Federal Reserve, was that you needed some kind of state agency to be the J.P. Morgan in that situation. But it just struck me that the fact that you could get these 7 or 8 bankers in J.P. Morgan's library, with Morgan himself locking them in, which is just it wasn't the first time he'd done this. He'd lock people in the room until they came to a conclusion that satisfied him. But yeah, it was. I don't know. I think the bourgeoisie is the American bourgeoisie is much more of a rotten, selfish formation than it was then. They were capable of some degree of collective action. They were coming together as a real conscious ruling class, late 19th, early 20th century, national and international scope. They had some kind of project. I mean, I don't want to get too misty-eyed about them because they were, cruel, imperialist, racist pigs, but they did have some sense of how to organize things over the longer term. I don't think this current crop of financiers and capitalists has anything like a longer-term vision. They're just like, I think we've reached, which Christian Parenti called the necrotic phase of American capitalism. It's that these people it's just a smash and grab thing now. And you look at like private equity, which has become so important in the financial and business landscape. That's nothing but a smash and grab ethic. It's these people are just not investing for the long term. They're not doing the things that capitalists are supposed to do. I mean, the whole alleged social contract, which nobody ever presented me to sign, but that's the line, is that we allow them to get rich because they do take the risks and do the investment and do the innovation, and they're rewarded for it. It was always a lot of bullshit involved in that, but there was. I think there was a larger grain of truth to it decades ago than there is now. I think these guys just have the shortest possible time horizon. And, I think it affects the way they think about the climate crisis. They don't think that, I don't know, whether they don't believe that life is going to be here or what they're going to run down in their bunkers when the water's rise.
Can I present you an alternative? I think it's the strain of, in this more modern day, VC world, it's this strain of libertarianism. It's
Oh
this
yeah,
strain of
absolutely.
just me and I'm all that matters. And if everybody thinks the way that I do, we'll all be great if all we do is look out for just ourselves. And the Peter Thielism of the Peter Thielification of these markets, it seems like that's, if you wanted to kind of draw a line in the sand between the JP Morgans of yesteryear and the Peter Thiels of today, it's that like monomaniacal focus on just the self.
Well, yeah, but then if you scratch a libertarian like Thiel or that whole crowd, they're actually quite authoritarian. They're really anti-democratic. They really want to run things. They want the world run like a corporation. So like Thiel thinks of this seasetting business. He wants to set up some sort of sovereign entity off the coast that he can run like a business. These people are really contemptuous of the masses, and they just want. Some of them are monarchists, or like some of them want dictators. This character, what's his name, Mencius Moldbug, Curtis Yarvin, who has the ear of people like Thiel and J.D. Vance. They're really contemptuous of the masses, and they will talk a lot of libertarianism, but they really are fundamentally authoritarian. And people wonders, for example, like Milton Friedman. Supposedly a libertarian of the old school. Why was he so close to Pinochet, the dictator? Well, for them, freedom is for the upper classes, and everyone else is meant to just shut up and go along. Friedman's grandson, Patry is his name, had a piece in a Cato Institute journal a few years ago in which he said he was just tired of democracy. He realized that libertarianism could never win elections. It's too unpopular. And so he's just ready to give up on democracy. And I think he's just being more honest than the rest of them are. The best definition of libertarianism I ever heard was, I got mine and fuck you.
Yeah, I mean, just like one of their intellectual leaders, Ayn Rand, who was a notorious tyrant, you know what I mean, in terms of her like close circles and the objectivist society and everybody that, related to her and was like a mentee of hers, detailed, what an awful authoritarian, person that didn't tolerate dissent or people disagreeing with her. I mean, the ideology has been founded by people that are like that for those purposes.
Oh, absolutely. But then I think she did take Social Security in her final days.
She did take Social Security in the final days.
That's right, yes.
But, Alan Greenspan was a protege of hers. And when Greenspan was appointed to the Fed, I called up the Fed's press office and said, what's with this, Ayn Rand protege taking over the Federal Reserve? That's kind of interesting. And, most of these people ignore me, but as soon as I mentioned Ayn Rand, they patched me through to their chief communications officer. And he said, "Oh, we have no comment on that, of course." And I said, "Has anybody else called for a comment?" He said, "No." Like, no one was interested in the fact that this Ayn Rand protege was taking over the Fed. But,
I don't even know. Were people like tuned in that way, the way that we are today? Like, I don't, to those sort of like that ideological inconsistency of putting somebody like that in that kind of a position. I mean, the
libertarians were.
Yeah.
No, the broad, the public wasn't. The journalistic world was not. Obviously, I was the only one who made that call. If the Fed guy was telling me the truth,
he said the magic word. Somebody get paid from PR.
The Freeman, I think it is. A little libertarian journal did an article sometime during Greenspan's reign at the Fed with the question, is Alan still one of us? And they concluded that he was. But, his problem, he ran this big statist institution. But, that image of Greenspan in the 2008 financial crisis with this pained look in his face, like not understanding, I don't understand it. Like, it wasn't supposed to happen like this. My kid, who was then 3 years old, I think, saw a picture of Greenspan on the front page of the Financial Times with that distressed look on his face. And he said, "Why is this man sad?" And, because his whole worldview is being challenged. And for, 6 months maybe, Greenspan maybe had some thoughts, but then he just went back to the old way of thinking, and everyone goes back to the old way of operating because it's working so well for them.
Well, speaking of the Fed, I wanted to ask about the kind of fork in the road that they're facing right now, because up till now they've been setting interest rates with the goal of reducing inflation. I think when last we spoke, inflation was above 8%. Now it's in the ballpark of 6, the goal being 2%. I remember seeing, we were talking about social media, I remember seeing on Twitter people predicting on Friday that Monday would be a bloodbath. And then over the weekend, seeing that the Treasury, the FDIC, the rest would step in and protect the depositors at SVB. On Monday, the market did well because the expectation was now the Fed is going to cool off on interest rate hikes in order to preserve the financial system because, that's creating too much strain on the system as it exists now. I wanted to ask, and also to get your opinion on, I saw this in, I think it was Eric Levitz in New York Magazine, the thought that it would actually be better to let some of these banks it's the implied that it's better to let them fail a little bit because that would create, some sort of moral hazard against risky lending that could bring down inflation
Like a culling.
on its own. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean that is a bit of playing a game of chicken. Like
right.
who knows? Will it spread? Will it get out of control? Is it like out of control nuclear reaction, or it's something you can control and get some power from it? I don't know the answer to that. In the bank failures of the 80s and 90s, and even the mid 2000s, or 2008, 2009, 2010, some of the depositors did not get paid off. So, I think something like a quarter of the instances, those with deposits above the legal limit did not get paid off, or at least took some kind of hit, even if it's not 100% loss, it was a partial loss. So this was an experiment, but this time also the management got kicked out, the stockholders and bondholders got wiped out, which is more severe than what previous models. So they're taking a hit. Might be a good lesson to the others, but it's been very funny to watch the transformation of monetary politics over the last 10 years. It used to be that Wall Street liked tight money and would always applaud when the Fed was tightening up because that would be, in the long term, good for financial assets and in the long term, weaken the working class and be great for financial returns. But over the last decade or so, they've gotten so used to all this free money and 0% interest rates that they're no longer this force for austerity that they once were. We used to talk about the bond vigilantes, that at any time inflation rose, the bond vigilantes would go crazy, dump bonds, interest rates would rise, panic would ensue, and the Fed would promptly tighten up. Now Wall Street is really a lobby for loose money. You see BlackRock and entities like that calling for the Fed to be easier. It's remarkable that how dependent these guys. That class used to love to talk about welfare dependency and how it was morally corrosive for people to get free money. But these people have really become dependent on it in such a large scale. The entire AFDC program, welfare, that Clinton wiped out, was like $25-30 billion a year in 1990s money. They can blow that much in a single bank bailout now.
The connection that I think of there is how, and it's been a couple of years since we had this argument. It was Trump was in office at the time, but remember there was like a thing about there was a narrative about how much money the U.S. Post Office loses every year. And so if the U.S. Post Office does something, it's supposed to maybe not make money necessarily.
It's a public service.
It's a freaking public service. It's okay. And then on the other hand, you've got all of these Silicon Valley Bank clients who the vast majority of them are heading up projects and startups that do not make money, that don't even make enough operating revenue to stay in business without all the free money that you're talking about. And it's just, it doesn't jive. And I know that almost every narrative that we can talk about with this subject comes back to hypocrisy. But it really rubs me the wrong way that these rock-ribbed, you'd call them rugged individualists, these masters of the universe, they it's not that something kicked the knees out from underneath their business. It's that their businesses, by and large, you talked about Roku. At least Roku makes something. The list that I saw that Roku was on was a bunch of things like Ubong and Jumbo and Gumblop. And you look them up and it's like, oh, that's the 45th most popular payment processing service that happens to run on the fucking same thing, that the same technology that we already have as a public service, our banking system. It's all built on bullshit, and it's just checks getting moved around for people. They don't even have operating revenue. And I feel like, I don't know. I feel like I'm taking goddamn crazy pills when I read about all these businesses and like they're like, I've run a business before. You know what happens when there's like a problem with the bank? Shit, you have to dip into your operating revenue, the money that you have on hand, maybe into petty cash to pay people out. These companies don't fucking have that because they're not making any money. And I feel like that's a big part that's lost in this, is that all these tealites and all of these SVB clients, they're not actually running successful businesses by and large.
No, it's true. I mean, it's just remarkable about this bubble we've seen, the unicorns and all this business, those venture capital funding over the past decade. You know, I remember the late '90s, the dot-com bubble, and looking in awe at some of these things. They just seem like crazy schemes that are never going to make a dime, but they are far more solid than anything we've seen in the last generation. And some of the products, you go back late '90s, some of those things, they were building the internet, fiber optic cables. Amazon, for all its evil doing, is a very successful company. It's very good at what it does. But as you say, there are things with funny names, and it's really hard to describe what their product is. And even Uber, which has been around for like a dozen years, still isn't really making money. It's just amazing how these people have just become so dependent upon venture capital handouts, which ultimately came from the Federal Reserve's money presses. But you look at some of these things, you say, do they ever have a prospect of making any money? And I don't know. And is what they're doing actually useful? I'm amazed. These tech overlords love to talk about how they're making the future and they're doing stuff that's so important. And you look at what they actually do, and it's like, what the hell is this nonsense?
Doug, where do we go from here? I mean, we've kind of like touched on it a little bit, but like, I guess we don't know what's in store for the financial system. I mean, we're seeing, pretty shaky foundations on a lot of these institutions. I mean, Credit Suisse is looking shaky, but yeah, what is your prediction, and how can this system be salvaged, or is it beyond repair? Are we just condemned to a cycle of boom and bust until capitalism completely breaks down and the climate crisis instant contradictions?
Well, it's really hard to summon too much optimism, and I'm temperamentally pessimistic. Although, I seem like a more or less happy
you never
person,
end up disappointed. At least that way, you never end up disappointed.
That's true. But it's really hard to find something good to say about the current situation. There are some good things in politics now. Me and my colleagues in DSA are trying our best to make things a little better. We're getting a little better in New York State. We've got, a little socialist caucus in the New York State legislature doing good things. But the broader political situation seems really, really grim. And the economy just seems more screwed than ever. There's little investment for the long term. Our upper classes are just selfish and rotten and can't think beyond the end of their noses or the next quarterly financial report. The climate crisis, I remember a few months ago on Twitter, I was having an exchange with Michael Arrington, who's this VC guy. He founded TechCrunch and all that nonsense. Yeah. And he is one of those people who had just moved from Silicon Valley to Florida. And he was very upset because his real estate agent had blabbed what his location was to some trade publication. I didn't know until this event that there's actually a Mansion trade press. So
yes, no, the real deal. I'm not going to. You know what? I'm not going to give him a plug on the website, but yeah, on the podcast. But yes, that's like an entire cottage industry down here. Where do rich people live? And what's
it's really grotesque, but kind of amusing. So anyway, he's mad at this broker because she revealed where he lives. So he's going to have to sell the house. But I looked up the address of where he'd moved to, and it's right on the ocean front, surrounded by canals. And I was like, dude, you left the high tax region, and aren't you worried that your house is going to end up underwater in a few years? And he blocked me. Promptly. And I have a friend who's a real estate banker in South Florida, and he's been in their financing. I mean, he's a Marxist, got in it through labor unions, but he's a very sensible guy, and he just looks at these people and says they just have no sense of the climate crisis at all. And you in Miami are right in the front lines of it. You know better than I what's going on there. Yeah. But it seems grim, and you have people like Michael Arrington not even being they didn't even want to hear about it. They're not able to plan for it. You would think that a serious ruling class would say, hey, we got a problem with this climate crisis, and we should really actually do something about it. But no, they just seem so short-sighted. And in a society like ours, it's so deeply hierarchical, so undemocratic, in which the masses of the population are they're a combination of socialization and structural design, completely just out of the system, demobilized from any kind of political action. The state of the ruling class is very important, and the state of our ruling class now is very, very debased and rotten. And they seem unable to do anything about these kinds of situations. So here we are on the fifth or sixth major financial crisis of the last several decades. And I have a hard time believing much of anything is going to change. We've seen, Biden talking a little tougher. We don't want to have another bailout. He doesn't want to repeat the mistakes of Obama. He understands what the political consequences of that are. But like I was saying earlier, the rich folks have everyone by hostage.
Right.
If you don't bail us out, then everything's going to come tumbling down. Ha ha ha. And then they have their bunkers where they're going to go when the waters rise.
No, there's your growth industry. If you want to get into tech and you want to, and you really actually want to make some money, the robots that are dogs with lasers in the eyes, that's the money. And for sell it to the rich people for their bunker protection. Robots.
But then they're going to have to get out at some point, and then if the society around them has collapsed, what does that mean? What have they saved themselves from? I think that's the ultimate libertarian delusion, that you can somehow seal yourself off in this underground bunker and save yourself.
Yourself. Yeah.
There really is such a thing as society. You're going to have to deal with it.
Everything's too big to fail now until it all fails. I'll tell you guys a story before we wrap up. So my ex-girlfriend and I, we wanted to take her mother out on a boat here in Miami because her mom liked boats. So we went to Bayside, which is a tourist trap area of Miami, and we rented this little boat tour of Biscayne Bay, which is the bay here that has the city view of Miami, and it was a nice boat tour. But what the tour actually consisted of, and we didn't realize this, was actually circling Fisher Island and Star Island and these islands where the celebrities and the millionaire and billionaire class of Miami lives in, and the boat captain and tour guide basically pointing out and saying this is where Gloria Estefan lives and this is where Jennifer Lopez lives, and just looking at these mansions and houses, and it was just so depressing and depraved, and
it's very depressing.
The whole time I was this is gonna be underwater relatively soon, and Doug, it's like you're saying, right? Our ruling class has no conception of the impending climate crisis and no plan for it. It reminded me of the idiots at Silicon Valley Bank, right? The same type of short-sighted, short-term thinking permeates everything. And it's
well, they always think they can insulate themselves from these things, but the climate crisis, there's no escape from that one. I mean, you can maybe hide from it for a little while, but it's going to catch up with you.
None of us are getting out of this alive.
Well, you can say that about life itself. So
yeah, exactly. We have so much more that we would love to talk with you, Doug. We're going to have you back on because I want to talk to you about other stuff too in the future. The idea that South Florida, and specifically South Florida, is a kind of a gullible mark for this, Silicon Valley tech hub of the future conversation and the way that we've bought into that. I would love to.
Well, you've got a long history of that stuff.
Yeah. Well, we're great at being marks down here in It's awesome. But again, our guest today, and I also want to get you on and pin you down on what kind of odds you would need to bet that any Silicon Valley Bank executive will end up behind bars for anything.
Oh, I'll say that right now, 0. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, no.
Again, I think I agree with that. With those odds, we get Vegas on the horn. Again, our guest today was Doug Henwood. You can find his writing in The Nation, where he is the contributing editor. You can also hear him on Behind the News, the podcast and radio show. We're going to link it here in the show notes, so you can just click right down there. Doug, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It was fun, and happy to come back anytime.